There are moments in aviation where everything changes in an instant, not because of mechanical failure, not because of weather, not because of some external force beyond anyone's control, but because of a decision, a choice made in a fraction of a second under enormous pressure with incomplete information, a decision that seems logical, seems safe, seems like the obvious right answer in that moment, but a decision that, once made, sets in motion a chain of events that becomes irreversible, that narrows options progressively until no good choices remain, until the outcome becomes inevitable. For the flight carrying Greg Biffle, Dennis Dutton, and Jack Dutton, that split-second decision came within the first minute after catastrophic engine failure. And that decision, more than the engine failure itself, more than any other single factor, is what doomed the flight. Today, we're going to examine exactly what that decision was, why it seemed like the right choice in the moment, why it was actually the wrong choice, and how a single decision made in seconds determined whether three people lived or died. Before we can understand the critical decision that doomed this flight, we need to understand the situation the crew faced in those first chaotic seconds after the engine failure. The Citation had just taken off from runway 10 at Statesville Regional Airport. The aircraft was climbing probably somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 feet above the ground. Weather conditions were marginal VFR with cloud ceilings around 1,200 feet broken and visibility about 5 miles in light drizzle. Both engines were running normally. Everything was routine. Then, without warning, catastrophic failure. Based on post-crash evidence showing the missing right-hand baggage compartment door and severe damage to the right engine's fan blades, the most likely scenario is that the baggage door came open and items from the compartment were ingested into the right engine. The engine destroyed itself in approximately 2 seconds. Fan blades shattered, compressor stages failed. The engine went from producing 2,500 pounds of thrust to producing zero thrust and massive drag almost instantaneously. The cockpit erupted in warnings. Master warning lights illuminated, possibly engine fire warnings. Oral alarms sounded, but more immediate than any warning light was the physical sensation. The aircraft yawed violently to the right as asymmetric thrust tried to spin the aircraft. Dennis Dutton, almost certainly in the left seat as pilot in command, would have immediately stomped on the left rudder pedal to counteract the yaw, fighting to keep the aircraft pointed straight ahead and under control. And in that moment, with the aircraft yawing, with alarms blaring, with warnings flashing, with his heart rate spiking and adrenaline flooding his system, Dennis Dutton faced a decision. The decision, the split-second choice that would determine whether everyone aboard lived or died. That decision was, do we continue climbing straight ahead to gain altitude and work this problem from a position of safety? Or do we turn around immediately and try to get back on the ground at the airport we just left as quickly as possible? Put yourself in that cockpit for a moment. You've just experienced a violent, catastrophic failure. You don't yet know exactly what failed or why, though you know from the instruments and the yaw that you've lost the right engine. You don't know if there's additional damage. You don't know if fire is spreading. You don't know if the situation is stable or deteriorating. You're low, maybe 1,500 feet above the ground. The airport is right behind you, maybe just a mile or two away. You just took off from there seconds ago. You know where the runway is, it's familiar, it's safe. Every instinct, every fiber of your being is screaming at you to turn around. Get back to that airport. Get this aircraft on the ground before anything else goes wrong. The instinct is so powerful, so overwhelming that it takes conscious effort, mental discipline, trained response to override it. And you have perhaps 5 seconds to make this decision before the aircraft's position and energy state make one option or the other significantly more difficult. Dennis Dutton made his decision based on the flight track data, which shows the aircraft climbing initially to approximately 2,000 feet and then beginning to maneuver back towards Statesville. He chose to turn back. He committed to an immediate return to the departure airport rather than continuing to climb away. And that decision, made in a split second under extreme stress, is what doomed the flight. Now, before we analyze why that decision proved fatal, I want to be absolutely clear about something. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking. This is not criticizing a decision from the comfort of a desk with unlimited time to think about it. Dennis Dutton was an experienced professional pilot facing a catastrophic emergency. He made the choice that seemed right to him in that moment based on his training, his experience and the information available to him. The fact that it proved to be the wrong choice doesn't make him a bad pilot or a careless person. It makes him human. It makes him someone who faced an impossible situation and made the best decision he could with the information and time he had. But we need to understand why it was the wrong decision, not to blame, but to learn, so that the next pilot facing the same situation might make a different choice and survive. Let's examine why turning back immediately while seeming like the safe choice was actually the choice that made survival impossible. The fundamental problem with the immediate turn back is that it commits you to a very compressed timeline with minimal margin for error. When you turn back from low altitude, you're accepting that you have perhaps 2 to 3 minutes maximum from the moment of the failure to getting the aircraft on the ground, 2 to 3 minutes to turn around, find the runway and marginal visibility, line up, configure the aircraft, and land. That's barely enough time to execute the basic maneuvers, let alone work through emergency checklists, diagnose problems, make informed decisions. Compare that to what happens if you continue climbing. If Dennis had maintained runway heading or turned only slightly to avoid obstacles and climbed to 3 or 4,000 feet before doing anything else, he would have bought himself 15 to 20 minutes of time, 15 to 20 minutes where the aircraft can fly safely on one engine, 15 to 20 minutes to run checklists, diagnose the problem completely, coordinate with air traffic control, set up a proper approach to an appropriate airport. At 3 or 4,000 feet, you can engage autopilot, which on the citation can maintain heading and altitude on one engine with no problem. With autopilot flying the aircraft, the pilot in command can focus entirely on systems management, on running checklists, on decision making. The workload becomes manageable even for one pilot flying alone. But at low altitude, maneuvering manually, trying to find a runway in poor visibility, there's no opportunity to engage automation. It's all hand flying under maximum stress with maximum workload. The decision to turn back immediately also commits you to returning to the departure airport, which may not be the best option. Statesville Regional is a small general aviation airport. The longest runway is about 4,500 feet, adequate for a citation under normal circumstances, but not providing much margin in an emergency with degraded performance. Charlotte Douglas International Airport, a major hub with runways over 10,000 feet and full emergency response capability, was only 32 miles away. At normal citation cruise speed, that's less than 10 minutes of flight time. Easily reachable if you climb to altitude and coordinate with ATC, but once you commit to the immediate turn back to Statesville, Charlotte is no longer an option. You don't have the time or the altitude to get there. You've locked yourself into Statesville, into the short runway, into attempting a visual approach in marginal weather with one engine. You've given up the option of a better airport with longer runways and better services. The decision to turn back immediately also creates enormous pressure to configure the aircraft early. When you're low and trying to make a runway that's close but not assured, you feel intense pressure to get the gear down, get the flaps out, get ready to land, because you might only get one chance at this. But early configuration in a citation operating on one engine is potentially fatal. We have direct evidence that the Biffle crew configured early. We have audio of Jack Dutton making a radio transmission where he states, "We're getting our gear down." The context of that transmission, the fact that it's part of a position report while they're clearly still maneuvering and not yet on a stabilized final approach, indicates the gear was being extended while they were still working to get lined up with a runway. And that configuration decision, driven by the time pressure created by the decision to turn back immediately, is what made recovery impossible. The citation operating manual explicitly states that the aircraft cannot maintain altitude with landing gear extended and flaps deployed while operating on one engine at maximum gross weight. It's not a matter of technique, it's physics. The drag from the gear and flaps exceeds the thrust available from one engine. Once you're in that configuration, you are descending, and the only question is whether you have enough altitude to reach the runway. They didn't. They impacted 1,800 feet short, 10 seconds of flight time from the runway. Those final 10 seconds required altitude they had already spent. Altitude consumed by the decision to turn back instead of climbing away. Altitude consumed by maneuvering at low altitude and poor visibility. Altitude consumed by the drag of early configuration. The split-second decision to turn back set in motion a sequence where altitude was continuously consumed until none remained. Now let's talk about what the alternative decision would have looked like and why it would have resulted in survival. Imagine the same scenario: engine fails catastrophically at 1,500 feet shortly after takeoff. But instead of turning back, Dennis makes a different split-second decision. He decides to continue climbing straight ahead. He maintains runway heading or turns only slightly to avoid obstacles. He focuses on maintaining airspeed above minimum control speed and climbing at the best single-engine climb speed, which for the citation is around 120 knots. The aircraft climbs on one engine. Climb rate is reduced from the 2,000 feet per minute they had on two engines to maybe 300 to 500 feet per minute on one engine, but they're climbing. In 2 minutes, they've gained another 600 to 1,000 feet. They're now at 2,500 or 3,000 feet. They continue climbing. In 5 minutes total from the engine failure, they're at 4,000 feet. At 4,000 feet, Dennis engages the autopilot. The autopilot can maintain heading and altitude on one engine with no problem. With the autopilot flying, Dennis can focus on systems. He runs the engine failure checklist. He identifies the failed engine, verifies the failure, begins the shutdown procedure. He closes the fuel shutoff valve. He discharges fire bottles if there's a fire indication. He reconfigures electrical and hydraulic systems to account for the lost engine. Meanwhile, Jack or Greg, whoever is in the right seat, is on the radio. They declare an emergency with Charlotte approach control. Citation, November 257. Bravo Whiskey declaring an emergency. We've had an engine failure, requesting vectors to Charlotte Douglas for an emergency landing. ATC responds immediately. They provide radar vectors. They coordinate with Charlotte Tower. They clear other traffic out of the way. They notify emergency services. The crew has time to brief the approach. They discuss the plan. They confirm that once they're on a stabilized approach with the runway made, they'll extend gear and flaps, not before. They'll stay in a clean configuration as long as possible to maximize performance. They set up for an ILS approach to one of Charlotte's long runways. ATC vectors them to intercept the localizer at 3,000 feet. They're high, they're stable, they have the runway in sight or on instruments. On short final, with the runway absolutely assured, they extend landing gear. The drag increases, the descent rate increases, but they're only a mile from the runway with 500 feet of altitude. They have enough. They touch down on a 10,000-foot runway with 3,000 feet to spare. Fire trucks and ambulances are staged alongside the runway. The aircraft rolls to a stop. Everyone unbuckles and evacuates. Everyone is safe. The aircraft is damaged, but everyone survives. That outcome was entirely possible. The aircraft was capable of it. The procedures existed for it. The only difference between that scenario and what actually happened was the split-second decision made in the first minute after the engine failure: continue climbing or turn back immediately. That one decision, made in a fraction of a second, determined life or death. So why did Dennis choose to turn back instead of climbing away? We can only speculate because we don't have the cockpit voice recorder transcript yet. But we can make educated guesses based on human factors research and what we know about pilot decision-making under stress. The instinct to turn back is incredibly powerful. It's hardwired into human psychology. When something goes wrong, we want to return to safety, to the known, to the familiar. The airport behind you represents all of those things. Continuing away from it, climbing away from safety, feels wrong at a visceral level, even when it's actually the right choice. Additionally, Dennis's experience may have worked against him in this scenario. He spent decades flying large airline jets, aircraft with very different performance characteristics than the citation. Large jets have enormous power margins. If you lose one engine on a Boeing 757 or 767, you still have tremendous capability. You can climb robustly. You can turn back from relatively low altitude and make it work. Dennis's mental model of single-engine performance may have been based on those aircraft. He may have expected the citation to perform better on one engine than it actually could, especially at high weight. There's also the factor of incomplete information. In those first seconds after the failure, Dennis didn't know exactly what had happened. He knew the engine had failed based on the yaw and the warnings, but he may not have known why. If the baggage door was open and creating noise and vibration, if there was uncertainty about whether there was fire or additional damage, The psychological pressure to land immediately would have been enormous if you're not certain the aircraft is going to hold together. Every second in the air feels like risking catastrophe. Training and procedures also play a role. The recommended procedure for engine failure after takeoff is clear: maintain control, maintain airspeed, climb to altitude, then deal with the problem. But that procedure requires overriding your instinct, and it requires having practiced the scenario enough times that your trained response is automatic. If Dennis hadn't recently practiced this specific scenario in this specific aircraft, if his training was based on airline procedures in aircraft with different performance, his trained response might not have aligned with the optimal response for the citation. There's also the time pressure factor. In those first 5 or 10 seconds after the failure, Dennis had to make a decision: continue climbing or turn back. Whichever choice he made, he needed to commit to it because the aircraft's position and energy state were changing every second. Delaying the decision, trying to think it through carefully, wasn't an option. He had to decide now. And under that time pressure, with stress hormones flooding his system, with alarms blaring and the aircraft yawing, he made the choice that felt right in that moment. The tragedy is that the choice that felt right was wrong. And once that choice was made, once he committed to the turn back, everything that followed was almost inevitable. The turn consumed energy and altitude. The need to find the runway in poor visibility consumed time and created stress. The pressure to configure early to be ready for landing led to gear extension while still high and maneuvering. The drag from the gear made maintaining altitude impossible. The descent rate exceeded the ability to reach the runway, impact short of the threshold. Each step in that sequence followed logically from the previous step. Each decision made sense in the context of what had been decided before, but the entire chain was set in motion by that initial split-second decision to turn back instead of climbing away. That's the decision that doomed the flight. Now, I want to talk about what this means for other pilots, because the value of examining this accident is not to assign blame, but to extract lessons that can save lives in the future. If you're a pilot, especially if you fly multi-engine aircraft, you need to internalize this lesson. When you lose an engine shortly after takeoff, your instinct will scream at you to turn around. That instinct will be overwhelming. It will feel like the obvious right choice, but you must override that instinct. You must resist it. You must make the decision right now while you're on the ground and thinking clearly that if this happens to you, you will climb first and turn back later, if at all. Make that decision now, before the emergency. Brief it before every flight. Verbalize it to your crew or to yourself. If we lose an engine on takeoff, we continue climbing straight ahead to altitude before we do anything else. We do not turn back immediately. We get altitude first. Say it out loud. Make it your commitment. Because when the real emergency happens, you won't have time to think it through. You'll do whatever you've mentally programmed yourself to do. If you've programmed yourself to climb first, you'll climb. If you haven't, your instinct will take over and you'll turn back. And depending on your altitude and conditions, that might kill you. Practice this scenario in simulator training. If you have access to simulator time, practice engine failures after takeoff. Practice continuing to climb instead of turning back. Practice engaging autopilot at altitude. Practice setting up approaches from altitude with time to work the problem. Make the correct response so automatic that you don't have to think about it when it happens for real. Also, understand your aircraft's performance limitations. The citation cannot maintain altitude with gear down on one engine at high weight. That's not a suggestion or a guideline. That's a hard limit. If you configure early, if you put the gear down before you're certain you can make the runway, you've committed yourself to a descent you can't arrest. Know your aircraft's single engine performance. Know at what weight and altitude you can or can't climb. Know what configurations are survivable and which aren't. That knowledge might save your life. For the investigators, for the NTSB, for the FAA, this accident should prompt questions about training standards for Part 91 citation operations. Are pilots being adequately trained for engine failures? Is the training emphasizing the critical importance of climbing to altitude before attempting a return? Are pilots practicing this scenario in realistic conditions with realistic stress? Or is the training perfunctory checkbox training that doesn't actually prepare pilots for the real emergency? There should also be questions about crew qualifications and the regulatory framework that allows minimally qualified second in command pilots in Part 91 operations. If Dennis was effectively flying alone because the person in the right seat wasn't experienced enough to help, that's a safety issue. Multi-crew aircraft are designed to be operated by two qualified pilots who can divide workload. Operating with one highly qualified pilot and one minimally qualified person who can't really help creates a single pilot operation in an aircraft not designed for that. For aircraft manufacturers and regulators, this accident should prompt questions about whether older aircraft should be retrofitted with baggage door monitoring systems. The fact that a door can open in flight and cause catastrophic engine failure with no warning to the crew is a design flaw. It's a single point failure mode with no backup. A simple sensor and warning light, technology that costs perhaps a few $100s, could prevent this type of accident. Should that be mandatory? The split-second decision that doomed the Greg Biffle flight was understandable. It was human. It was made by an experienced pilot doing his best in an impossible situation. But it was also wrong, and 3 people died because of it, not because Dennis Dutton was a bad pilot, not because he was careless or reckless, but because he made a split-second decision under extreme stress that seemed right, but was actually fatal. That's the harsh reality of aviation. Decisions made in seconds determine outcomes. There's no pause button, no timeout to consider options, no do-overs if you choose wrong. You get one chance to make the right choice, and if you choose wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic and irreversible. That's why training matters, why procedures matter, why mental preparation matters, why making decisions before the emergency matters. Greg Biffle, Dennis Dutton, and Jack Dutton deserve to survive. The engine failure they experienced was survivable. Other crews have faced the same failure and lived. The difference was one decision, one split-second choice. That's all that separated survival from tragedy. If this analysis helps one pilot make a different choice, if it saves one life, then examining this tragedy in detail will have been worthwhile. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis. Share this with pilots you know. And remember, in aviation, one decision can change everything. Choose wisely.